Hi and welcome to another Unreal Exploration. In this video, I'll break down my full workflow for creating this cinematic dialogue scene in Unreal Engine 5.6, capturing all the performance myself using just my phone and a simple home setup. We'll go through metahumans, facial capture,
voice performance,
body mocap, animation polish, cinematic camera, and more. I want to share practical techniques and small discoveries that help me to push the scene from raw capture into something that actually feels highly polished. Before starting on this cinematic dialogue, I just moved my main character, my knight, over from ALS to GASP, and more importantly, onto the MetaHuman framework. I'd already experimented a bit with webcam-based facial capture using LiveLink, but I really wanted to push toward a proper cinematic dialogue scene, something closer to what I've seen in some of my favorite video games, such as The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. So the first step was getting a second character up to the same quality level, so he had somebody to talk to. For this, I chose my cleric character that I made for offline rendering back in 2022. To get her into Unreal Engine, I'm using MetaHuman Creator. There's this common misconception I often see online in comment sections that all metahumans look generic, but in my opinion, that mostly comes down to how they are created. If you only tweak a few settings and use existing content, they'll indeed look generic. But if you bring your own custom inputs, such as custom geometry, custom textures, and grooms, you can push them much further. I make heavy use of the conform feature to bring in my own geometry, which meant I had to retopologize my original model to the MetaHuman topology. On top of that, I'm using a lot of custom textures, including wrinkle maps. You can't access all those textures from the MetaHuman Creator UI, but after you export your MetaHuman, you can access the source data in the content browser. And there I can refine even more maps, including the roughness map, which is one of the most important ones to tweak to break away from the default look. With that approach, you can get something that feels much more bespoke, truly high-end, AAA, and not generic. Next, let's take a look at the facial capture. I already experimented a bit with LiveLink using a webcam in the past, but for this project I wanted to push for the highest quality I could get as a solo developer. So I used the LiveLink Face app on my iPhone, that way you can also capture depth information. I recorded the performance instead of streaming it in real time, then I processed that recording using a MetaHuman performance asset. The big advantage here is that you can use a custom MetaHuman identity, which keeps the performance much closer to your actual face. Creating an identity is fairly simple. You can capture a few reference poses, looking forward, a bit to each side, and a teeth pose. For the best result, I recommend doing this in the same session as your recordings, so everything stays nice and consistent. That meant I chose to do all the takes in one go. In total, I recorded over 140 takes just to get the dialogue right. The biggest challenge wasn't the tech, but actually getting the right performance. One of the main issues I ran into was the eye direction. If you look at your phone screen while recording, the character ends up looking a bit cross-eyed instead of actually looking at the other person. So instead, I focus on a point in the distance to simulate eye contact. That also means you can't really read of any script, so I had to memorize all the lines. And on top of that, you actually need to act out the scenes. I did my best here, but having a real voice actor would definitely elevate the result. The reason I still chose to do it myself is because I wanted to capture the full performance, not just drive it from an audio file. This was my first time doing this pipeline, so I needed quick access to the facial performance in case I needed to do reshoots. Hence, I chose myself as the guinea pig. This is also the reason I did the voice acting for both the knight and the cleric. Once you have a take you're happy with, getting it onto your character is actually very straightforward. Since all metahumans share the same facial rig, the animation can just be reused across the different characters without any special setup. Next, let's look at the voice pipeline. Once I have a performance I'm happy with, I need a voice that matches the appearance of the character. For that, I use a voice changer, in my case 11 Labs, but the tool itself isn't the important part. What really matters is the preserving of the timing of the original performance. If the timing shifts, even ever so slightly, the lip sync will start feeling off. Ideally, you would have a voice performance you are happy with from the start, done by a real voice actor. Then you can skip this entire step. But if you're working solo, like me, this is the most effective way to bridge the gap. Here a small demo of my learnings inside of 11 Labs. So first we're going to drag in our original audio. That sounds something like this.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
Generating with the default settings sounds like this.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
Dragging down similarity will get it truer to the target voice but can mess up the timing and therefore the lip sync.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
That's why for my workflow I always crank up similarity all the way to the right.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
Stability again makes it sound a little bit more like the target voice, but in my opinion makes it sound a bit too robotic.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
That's why I always put stability as low as I can.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
If it still feels a bit flat, I play with the style exaggeration. Remember, every time you generate the speech it's slightly different, so I tend to just spam variants until I get one that I like.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
Then it's just a matter of experimenting with different variations until you find something that fits the character. This is quite an enjoyable process, but also extremely subjective. Here are some examples before we move on to the next topic.
I don't know what I am to this place anymore.
I don't know what I am to this place anymore.
I don't know what I am to this place anymore.
Now let's move on to the body motion, because without convincing body language, the performance feels incomplete. Even subtle things such as posture, weight shifts and timing make a huge difference in how believable the dialogue scene will feel. Ideally, I would use a full motion capture setup, but as a solo developer, I don't have the space or expensive equipment such as a mocap suit. And at the time of this recording, Unreal Engine doesn't have a built-in video to animation solution like it does for facial capture. That's where QuickMagic comes in. QuickMagic reached out to me while I was planning the next steps of my project, and it ended up being the missing puzzle piece that made me commit to building out this dialogue scene that I wanted to do for a while. They provided me with plenty of credits to test my pipeline, which made it possible to iterate quickly. And they also gave me a promo code for the viewers of this video. Normally, a free QuickMagic account starts with 50 V-Coins, 1 V-Coin being roughly 1 second of animation at 30 FPS. But if you sign up using promo code ARNO and subscribe to their newsletter, you'll start with more than double that amount. The beauty of QuickMagic is that it's lightweight and a fast way to capture natural body motion without needing a full mocap setup. All you really need is a camera. In my case, I just use the same phone I used for my facial capture, along with a cheap tripod. This is how it works. You simply upload your video and select your export settings. You then drag in the skeleton you want to retarget to onto the detected person. In my case, I'm using the Unreal 5.6 mannequin. For the motion generation, I stick to the basic model. I tried the V2 version, but it burns way more V-Coins and doesn't really give noticeably better results for these very simple static animations that I'm processing. And I like to set the A pose as the first keyframe of the animation that can help later for retargeting. I shoot all my videos at 60 FPS, but 30 is fine, since that's going to be the frame rate of my animation. Then, after just a few minutes of waiting, you can inspect your mocap animation. And if you like the results, you can hit the download button and get the FBX. One quick tip I found: since this is an optical solution, clothing actually matters quite a bit. I noticed much better results when wearing lighter colors. When I wore my black clothing, like I do usually, the tracking had a harder time picking up the motion. Now let's bring the animation into Unreal. I like to do this in a clean project, that way no unrelated animation will show up in the retarget window. I did prep this clean project with lightweight placeholder meshes for both my cleric and my knight. These placeholders use the same skeleton as their full MetaHuman counterparts, so all animations I make for these will also work on the final MetaHumans. But they're much faster to work with. No materials, no grooms, just simple skinning. So I can quickly iterate on animations before applying it to the final characters. When importing the animation, I target the UE5 mannequin. It's going to give you an error, but that's fine, it will still import correctly. Sometimes the orientation comes in wrong, depending on your settings. If that happens, you can fix it with a simple rotation adjustment on the root and key it in place, save it, and check the thumbnail to confirm. And now we want to retarget to the placeholder, so we need to set the target to the knight placeholder, select the correct animation, and export it. And now you can see we have the animation on our knight character. One common issue I ran into is the shoulder and clavicle positioning. Especially on the male characters, the shoulders tend to sit too low. So I go in and apply a small offset, lifting and rotating them back into a more natural pose. Applying it on a layer and keying them all into place, similar like I did the root rotation fix. This is a quick fix, but it makes a big difference in how the animation reads. And once that's done, I save the animation. And now I can bring the animation back into the main project and continue iterating there. Now that we're in the main project, I want to see how everything holds up on the final MetaHuman. There are a couple of ways to preview this. You can assign the animation asset directly to the MetaHuman for quick previewing, but I prefer working in a level sequence. I usually name it the same or similar to the level so I know which one it's associated with. And then I drag in my knight and delete the control rig. Then we'll import the animation from QuickMagic and more importantly the audio from the original video that's synced to it.
I've seen what takes root in their absence. I've seen what takes root in their absence.
Let's now also bring in the facial animation and the audio track for that. That's the one that got voice changed in ElevenLabs. And now comes the key insight. I also always say the dialogue during my body mocap. That way I can align the two audio waveforms to get a proper sync between both the body and facial animation. Usually the waveforms won't align perfectly because they're not the same performance, but it will give you a really good indication of timing.
I've seen what takes root in their absence.
Now that things are roughly aligned, I trim down the scene to just the usable portion, adding as much padding as I can, so cropping it just before the animation repeats itself. I then want to make sure the padded area is also occupied with facial animation, because it's currently shorter and defaults back to the bind pose when there's no animation data. To do this, I copy a part of the current facial animation, where the pose is neutral, and timescale it until it fits the padded area and then blend it in. At this point, I'll start doing small corrections. For example, here the head direction feels slightly off. I can quickly adjust that using a control rig and key some animation on top. These are subtle tweaks, but they help to make the performance feel more intentional. Once I'm happy with the result, I bake both body and facial animation down into clean animation assets. This gives me a stable, flattened version that I can reuse and bring into my final scene. The reason I structure this way is so the end of both clips stay aligned, being able to sync body and facial animation, while I can use the beginning of the facial animation clip to align the audio, ensuring a perfect sync when bringing them into my main level sequence. Now we can do some polish. The final sequence takes place in the abandoned cathedral that I picked up on the Fab Marketplace during one of the free monthly assets.
I've seen what takes root in their absence.
Out of the box, the raw QuickMagic body motion and lifelink facial performance already looks pretty good. But to really sell the performance, you still need to refine it. One of the things I always focus on is the eye direction. Getting the eye lines right immediately makes the acting feel more believable. To adjust this, I bake the captured facial animation to the MetaHuman facial control board. Then set the look at switch to 1, which gives me a visual handle to control where the character is looking. I usually place this by freely moving the camera in the viewport, switching between the camera view and scene view to line things up properly. One important thing here is that I don't want to remove the existing motion. Those small wiggles in the animation actually add a lot of life to the performance. So instead of overriding it, I just guide the overall direction by setting new keys on the additive layer in the control rig. That way, my knight is actually making eye contact with the cleric. I'll scrub to the timeline to make sure the relationship holds throughout the entire shot by setting a few more keys on the timeline on that additive layer. Just fixing the eye lines already improves the acting significantly, but you can push it further by adding small, motivated looks. Some tricks I apply repeatedly during this piece are a quick glance towards the runes when they're mentioned, or looking down when they're talking about a bad memory. These are subtle changes, but they help to make the performance feel more intentional. And this is how our progress is looking now that we established eye contact.
I've seen what takes root in their absence.
Something that happened quite often is that the body motion didn't match my intent once I saw everything in context. In this case, the animation felt too intense, almost aggressive. The dialogue itself is quite calm, so this sudden burst of motion doesn't feel right for the scene. So what I want to do here is soften the performance and bring down the emotional intensity. The way I approach this is by layering the animation. First, I duplicate the original body motion onto a new layer and slow it down to about half speed. Then I align the key pose, in this case the most extreme forward motion, and blend the two together. This gives me a softer version of the same performance without losing the original intent. If it's still too strong like here, I like to take it one step further. I isolate a small slither of the animation and slow it down a lot more and use that almost like a resting pose, layered on top. Then I adjust the weight until the motion feels right. In the initial block-in, I also animated the root motion, which turned out to be a bit too much. So I scaled that back here to keep the character more grounded. Once I'm happy with the overall motion, I bake the results down to a control rig and make small adjustments on top. In this example, tweaking the head tilt on an additive layer to better match the overall tone of the line. You can take this tweaking as far as you want, but I prefer to keep the changes minimal and capture as much as possible in the original performance. Since both characters in the scene are quite stoic, I found myself toning things down most of the time. Having them move less or slower actually helped to make them feel more grounded and heroic. Now a quick example of that.
For the meaning those stones once carried, I could use a sword by my side. For the meaning those stones once carried, I could use a sword by my side.
Next, let's refine the facial performance to make the acting feel more intentional. We already have a strong base from the facial capture, but same as with the body performance, now that we see everything in context, including the changed voice, we can push the performance further. In this case, my knight is a very stoic and serious character, so one of the things that worked very well for him is to emphasize certain words using subtle eyebrow movements. For example, adding a slight angry brow expression on the most emphasized word in the sentence. This is really where knowing your character's personality comes in. It's a good idea to study actors because they're the masters of stressing and accentuating emotional notes. To do this, we'll go back into the additive control board layer on the face, the one we added to correct the eye direction. Then I isolate the brow controls to keep things focused. In this example, I want to emphasize the word scene. So first, I block out the start and end of the word with neutral keys. Then I find the peak moment in the audio and push the brows there to create emphasis. After that, I check the result in the main camera, and as usual, it's way too strong at first. So I go into the curve editor and refine both the intensity and the timing until everything feels natural. One small trick I like to use is offsetting some of the keys by a frame or two. That way, not everything moves at exactly the same time, which makes the whole motion feel more organic. I also noticed some jitter in the original captured performance. You can easily clean that up by checking for any harsh changes in the animation curves and smoothing them out. My background is mainly in character art and not so much in animation, so it's great if you can consult a friend or colleague who is well versed in this type of character animation. In my case, that was Wintech, who gave me some great advice. Links to his work in the description. The final cherry on top that really brings the scene to life is some camera animation. Without it, everything can feel too clean, almost sterile. I like to add subtle camera movement that responds to the performance. For example, when the knight steps forward and rises slightly, I adjust the camera position and rotation to follow that motion. But instead of matching it perfectly, I let the camera lag behind by quite a few frames, as if the camera operator was caught off guard by the movement and needs to catch up. That small delay makes the movement feel much more natural. On top of that, I always add a very subtle layer of camera shake. It's almost unnoticeable, but it helps to break the perfect stillness of a digital scene. When the camera is moving, I increase the shake slightly to make the motion feel less mechanical. Finally, I make sure the focus stays on the main character. You can use the debug focus plane to visualize this. I usually aim to keep the most important eye in focus, but I don't try to make it perfectly locked. Letting the focus drift slightly actually helps to reinforce that handheld cinematic feeling. All this is extremely subtle. It's very easy to exaggerate, but together, all these small camera choices make the whole scene feel much more alive. As seen here in this final result.
I've seen what takes root in their absence.
For the end shot, I wanted to add this overhead angle of the heroes walking towards the church ruins. At this point, I ran out of Quick Magic V coins, but I also didn't quite know how to approach the mocap with the stairs. so I decided to approach this with a different solution, using the take recorder to record gameplay animations directly to the sequencer. Make sure you set the frame rate correctly and add all the relevant actors. Then simply hit play and start recording. One thing that caught me off guard was that the stairs didn't have a proper collision mesh, so I did have to go in and create one specifically for this shot. You can create as many of these take recordings as you want and merge them in your main sequence. So I did the whole thing twice, once for my knight and once for the cleric. Hopefully this video gave you a solid starting point to build your own workflow. As conclusion, the main takeaway is this. You don't need a full studio setup to create a cinematic dialogue. What matters is having a solid workflow, understanding the performance, and being willing to iterate until it works. Now, please sit back and enjoy the final result.
This place, it once belonged to your order?
What remains of it? These stones don't bear faith, just memories.
And you? Are you just a memory to this place?
I don't know what I am to this place anymore.
A ghost then, returning to a place that no longer exists.
I held faith that someone would be sent, that if I stayed long enough, duty would be answered. I did not, however, expect someone like you. You don't exactly look ordained.
Whatever the church wanted from me, they already took. I'm here of my own accord.
Them you've seen behind their righteous words. They call it service, duty, sacrifice. But those zealots never linger. They never stay long enough to see what's left behind after they exact their justice.
I've seen what takes root in their absence.
That's why I must go up there, to see what might lurk between those old pillars finds no home there, out of respect for the meaning those stones once carried. I could use a sword by my side, assuming those two swords are not just for show.
Thank you for sticking around until the end of the video. And huge thanks to Sander van Zanten for composing original music for this piece, and to Michael Elie for the sound effects, ambience and Foley work. If you learned something useful from this workflow or have suggestions that could improve it even further, feel free to share them in the comments. And hopefully I'll be back soon with something even more ambitious.